Hi class, we are going to cover organizational communication for this time round, and this is one of the most misunderstood and yes, the most challenging task, especially for the managers of today and tomorrow. And of course, it was very challenging in the past. So when we mean what we mean by organizational communication is sometimes an art, sometimes a science. Today we're going to blend the two. So we are going to be able to maybe talk it in terms of an art and a science. And how can we make both kind of functional for us to use this important tool in organizations for better performance, for better teamwork, for positive organizational outcomes such as motivation, commitment, satisfaction, and overall the bottom line thriving of the organizations. So the people make the place. First of all, let's not forget that. Whether you work online or from home, it doesn't matter. Without your contributions, the organizations can't go so much to like they couldn't really advance to the levels that they aspire. So what we need to know is whatever modality that we work with, online or in person or hybrid models, communication is going to be always a one of the pivotal aspects of organizational processes that enables again both individual task-based and also organizational outcomes, and they have this power to ease or sometimes uh, kind of make it hard for people to really come to a certain place with what they want to do together. So without communication, we can't really talk about a teamwork. Without communication, we can't talk about manager-subordinate relationship. Without communication, we can't talk about carrying the water up the hill as an organization. Without communication, we cannot talk about organizations at all. Communication is this, the glue that kinds of keeps us together. Otherwise, we will just working independently without, necessary interdependencies or interlinkages that would definitely hurt the organization in the long run. So let's go like deep dive into what communication entails in organizations, and let's ask some of the questions along the way. Okay, so studies usually show that managers spend over 70% of their time communicating. Okay, and if this is so, why is it still their number one challenge? Again, so there is a difference between communicating, meaning doing it versus doing it really well. Communicating well versus just communicating, and there is a huge difference between these two concepts. Organizational communication as a term usually focuses on the work done and meeting some organizational goals. So communication also has some goals, although it looks like a very kind of process-related term, it also involves results. Focuses on change and adaptation. So we usually focus on the change and adaptation of the organizational processes. It focuses on social aspects and motivation of individuals. As I said in the beginning, it has so many ramifications for motivation and commitment of the individuals at the workplace. And yes, it really serves as the glue that kind of keeps us together and enables us to work together in peace and harmony. Okay. What are some opportunities, like don't misunderstand me, these could be opportunities for communication or miscommunication, but again miscommunication is more common in organizations rather than communication, so we said miscommunication opportunities, so things that lead to miscommunication problems, which is why some people don't get the message across, or why they're being misunderstood, or sometimes they can't really use communication well as a tool. Okay, role of the communicator. So whoever the communicator is, this could be the sub, this could be the superordinate, whoever that is, there is a role associated with this person. And then you of course use some variables such as language, symbols, word usage, your body language is included. the way you use the words and statements, they all have a role. The type of channel you use. So whatever channel you use, like it could be an email, it could be electronic ways, it could be phone, it could be in written form. So whatever channel you use also has a lot of room for change, and it also has a lot of impact. Content of the communication, whatever you communicate, what's the content? Characteristics of the sender and receiver. In a communication process, there's always a sender of the message and receiver of the message. So when we say there's a sender, we mean the person who initiates the conversation, who initiates the dialogue. And then the receiver takes the message and returns something. Okay, something in return. Okay. So there's always a sender and receiver, and there's always something we call communication channel. Okay. And then the context. So the context always differs. Let's say you are going to have an important conversation with your manager over some of the performance management appraisal issues. Sticking that into a coffee time for only 15 minutes might not be the good context for discussing those things, because you would be rushing it and your manager would be rushing it, and there might be a lot of room for miscommunication and misunderstanding. So context, timing, as well as the channels, the context are very important. And they might, unfortunately, if you don't use them well, if you don't choose them or use them well, they might lead to miscommunication problems. Okay, so in every kind of organizational communication, we always want to be heard, right? We always want to be heard. We want the other party to listen to us, to be able to understand us. So in this case, we are using some techniques which are multiple, and sometimes these techniques that we use could be leading to interference or misinterpretations by the receiver. So whenever you do some multiple techniques, be careful, because there might be a chance of misinterpretation, interference, and then influence tactics might affect what you hear. So the person actually not genuinely wanting to communicate with you, but trying to influence you from behind. So what happens is that because of the ingenuity of this issue, you might, you might be hearing some different things rather than the symbols can interfere with what you hear. Yes, sometimes, let's say you associate the symbol in an email, let's say a question mark, okay, or let's say an exclamation mark, or let's say a full stop in some sentence. That might lead you to different places. And the symbols, of course, whenever you use them in your writing, reading, or speaking, they can interfere. They can really interfere. So make sure you use those very wisely and mindfully. Nonverbal factors, okay? Nonverbal factors can interfere with what you hear, as I said, like the person's smile, the person's angry look, or let's say the person's hand gestures, the demeanors. Okay, so these are all the things like bodily movements, demeanors, and everything. They all interfere with what you hear and what you speak. So these things are actually very important cornerstones, pillars of communication processes, also in the organization. Some barriers. When we talk about barriers to effective communication, we talk about communication skills which are ineffective, meaning maybe you are trying to show how you listen to the other, but you're stopping the person every second. Like you're listening a little and then you spot the person with another question. So before this person ends speaking, you are intervening, disturbing constantly, incessantly, and this person feels that he or she should be just out of this conversation altogether. So these are ineffective communication skills. Sometimes we try to use them, but not to their not to the level of quality in which they should be done. Less qualified, less quality, and sometimes you might be using them incorrectly, so that leads to ineffective communication skills. Negative attitude towards the situation. So whenever you have some negative attitude towards the situation, then you have a barrier. Information overload. Sometimes lack of information or too much information can intervene with people's thinking processes, with communication processes, or the channels that we use. Inconsistency with our frame of reference. So we are referencing somebody or some source when we talk about something, but then we kind of reference something completely different next time. So there's inconsistency. So what does it lead to? A lack of credibility. So you will be losing credibility over time, not just on that night, just on a day, but you can just lose it over time eventually. Okay. And then physical location. Of course, these could be barriers. Let's say you don't have Zoom, you don't have any kind of technological device to be able to listen to this course. Then you have a physical location problem. Then you are in a physical area where these things are not supported. So importance of that. And then distractions. Of course, when you listen to somebody, when you try to understand where they're coming from, there could be some distractions. It could be related to you, it could be related to the other party. Again, like maybe ringing of your cell phone or ringing of the other person's cell phone. Uh, sometimes, those distractions could be as drastic as an ambulance, passing by your door, or sometimes a noisy neighbor comes and makes noises and you don't want to hear that. So there are a lot of distraction issues. And then defensiveness. If you are defensive in your communication, meaning that if you if you really uh, are looking at this not as a developmental opportunity, okay, not as a developmental opportunity, but as something that we need to defend against, okay, then defensiveness gets in the way of effective communication. Because whenever you try to get the message across, if the person is misunderstanding it for certain reasons underlying defensiveness, then it kind of is a big barrier to effective communication. Okay, why focus on improving this kind of skill at all? Why do we need to bother with communication skill? Well, usually, maybe you've seen this or not, but in many writings of the job ads, you see these lists of qualifications. So usually employers list communication skills as a basic requirement even, and sometimes they even see it as a primary flaw because the candidates come there for an interview, and if they make a mistake with communication skills, then you could be easily switching to another candidate. Are you comfortable with your ability to communicate orally in writing? It's very important. Sometimes you could be very good at your ability to communicate orally and or writing, and you may not be comfortable with that. You may not be quite comfortable with your skill, with your ability. So understanding the comfort level that you have with your abilities is critical. Do you know how to listen? And if not, is this a problem? So do you know how to listen? So do people tell you, hey, you're not listening to me anymore. I don't see your eyes here. I don't see you here. So the best way to understand how do you understand how they listen to you is to ask for feedback. So make sure you're open to feedback about listening, because this is the best way you learn about how much listener you are. Do you know how to give and receive effective feedback? So these are important ones as well. In our lifetime, in our work life, we will always be in a position where we will receive feedback and we will give feedback. So receiving also requires some skill, because you want to answer to let's say whatever observer, and also giving feedback is very important. You should be making it mostly based on SMART objectives. Let's say specific, measurable, attainable, result-oriented, time-bound. So again, you need to know how to kind of specify this person's feedback points in behavior forms. Otherwise, it becomes a lot of defense, and people will be defending their positions no matter what. Because you kind of came through as a manager, you gave them a lot of general and blurred statements, which could mean anything. So they got an issue with that. But instead, if you did talk to them about their specific behaviors in certain circumstances or occurrences, if they know what you're talking about, especially regarding a date and a time and a place, then you're on the right track. So make sure you learn and you try to understand. I'm going to also talk about that more in this course. Uh, how do you give and receive effective? Okay. Okay, another important topic that we need to know is upward, downward, horizontal communication in organizations. So what is upward, what is downward, what is horizontal? And as the name and term implies, it's pretty straightforward, right? Upward is mostly, what you do to the up, what you communicate to the upper level, and downward from upper level to lower levels, and horizontal with peers, with colleagues, who are in same ranking or similar ranking inside the organization. Okay, first of all, we need to think about a very good superior and subordinate relationship. So, supportive climate usually leads to job satisfaction. The research shows that supportive climate leads to this, job satisfaction. Openness in superior and subordinate relationship, very important. If you are not open, if you really hiding things from your supervisor and from your colleagues, then you won't be able to communicate very well, and since you're hiding information, they won't believe you. Okay. Another one, job satisfaction and frequency of communication. So there is some research that shows that the less frequency of communication, less job satisfaction. Because when people don't communicate about things, they will feel left out, they will feel lonely, they will feel helpless. Sometimes they wouldn't really know what to do. There could be a lot of derailment from what they do in terms of their role. So, job satisfaction is very much related with that. So to be able to communicate and ask questions to your manager, to your peers as well. Job performance and supervisory communication. So there's a big, big, big relationship between the two. Again, supervisory communication meaning downward communication, and at the same time, it has very positive relationship with job performance. Communication involvement and commitment. So whenever you communicate, you need to make sure that you are involved in that communication process and you're committed to that communication process. And again, nobody creates communication just for the sake of it. There's always a reason, especially in the business world. People do not communicate with one another just because they need to socialize. They communicate with one another because they do their job through communication. Since you're in different locations, maybe you are a cross-functional team working from different teams, or you might be trying to understand what that training entails. Again, always communication in place, and communication, that's why, is very critical because it leads to involvement or commitment if done well. If not done well, you could see some really dire consequences of lack of or mediocre type of communication process. Okay, what is formal communication channels? For every communication, we talk about a channel. So we talk about a channel not like TV channels that these are mostly channels, that those are tools that we use for communication. Today, what's the most important communication channel that you use? I bet it could be Snapchat or something similar to that, or Reddit maybe, but not Facebook. Facebook kind of started to be appealing more to the older age people. Uh, and again, what is the most ideal and attractive one for you? Nowadays, it looks like your generation is very interested in Instagram, Snapchat, and maybe Google searches. But again, it flows, in this case, a communication channel flows within a chain of command or task responsibility defined by the organization. So the communication always goes hand in hand with your business, with your tasks, with your goals. Okay, so it's always next to that. Downward, as I said, superior to subordinate. Upward, from subordinate to superior. Lateral, across peers or co-workers. So again, these are all the types of channels and communication that shows us the direction of that communication. And when it is downward, it's pretty simple, straightforward. Your supervisor talks to you, and then upward, you talk to your supervisor, and then lateral, you talk to your peer, you talk to your colleague. Okay. When we have downward communication, we talk about implementation of goals, strategies, and objectives. So we always talk about implementation. We talk about job instructions and rationale. Sometimes this may not be as straightforward because it depends on the type of manager you are in terms of how much you actually give job instructions to your people. Okay, some people never do. So people try to figure out themselves and they are embarrassed if they happen to ask questions. They don't want to ask questions because they don't want to be embarrassed. So these are all like communication related problems, especially in downward communication from supervisor to subordinate. Procedures, practices are very important. What is our procedure for, let's say, communication in this organization? Uh, what are sort of practices related to those procedures? So these need some creative work. Performance feedback. So whenever you have a downward communication from your manager, you get feedback in terms of your performance, in terms of the things you could be differently. And then indoctrination, unfortunately, in some organizations still today, maybe some religious organizations even, this could be part of the problem. And, to be able to get away with these kinds of problems, more and more people need to be able to listen to one another, be in a dialogue, and be able to exchange ideas freely in an equal footing. Okay. Okay, barriers to downwards communication. So there are always a communication location or a kind of direction that the communication takes place. For example, downward is, uh, from superordinate to subordinate. Upward from subordinate to manager. Lateral, usually horizontal relationships. Okay, so what are some of the barriers to downward communication? Well, if you make it a one-way communication process where you only say the words you say and you don't hear any answers from the other party, you don't listen to what they have to say, that's one-way communication and that's a barrier to your effective downward communication. Differences in values and perspective. So some people could be different in values and their perspectives, and sometimes it might work as a wall against each other. Yes, it does. It might seem similar here, small here, but it's not. Mistrust, as is always the case with many other types of structuring the organization, mistrust is another group which you use, like communication. So mistrust is very important. Psychological conflicts of leadership. So whenever you have some conflict as a manager, as a leader in the group, for the group's long and short-term projects, then that kind of leaks, and you kind of witness that it creates such a turmoil in the organization. How to improve downward communication? Well, we say it's two-way communication. It has to be, so make sure whenever you talk to somebody, you make it dialogue-like. You make it, reciprocal, two-way. Multiple channels. So as much as you can, don't just rely on the email. Try to bring in like a note, physical note to their attention. Try to make sure you also talk on the phone. So make sure you use different channels to be effective. Understanding values and perceptions. So making sure that you understand the values of perceptions of people that report to you, so that you kind of uh, how can I say, like, maybe adapt your communication style to their needs. Trust and involvement. I mentioned this, very important. Recognize personal identity. So whoever is with us, it could be first year, let's say intern. It could be your first year hire. So it could be somebody from a different culture. So make sure you are uh, recognizing the personal identities of these people and also you're consistent in your verbal and nonverbal messages. Don't say one thing and then do something else. Let's say when you're talking about something a little bit tragic or kind of sad in the organization or the issue, make sure your nonverbal messages also go in line with that, like your maybe the way you use your hands, the way you wear, the way you respond. For example, you may not be smiling when talking about this tragic thing. So smiling instead of having a neutral face. These are all problems with consistency. And then active listening. So what is active listening? Well, active listening is something that many people in the world don't know and how to apply, and they don't apply it really well. So even people who could be teaching this course, or even people who are teaching some other courses on communication, they may not be really good at listening to others. Honestly speaking, because of my psychotherapist background, I'm so used to having active listening skills. So that's how I was able to listen to my students, listen to the clients, listen to the upper level management in CUNY. So, I mean, listening is a skill that you need to harness over time. And yes, the more you do it, the better it becomes. So don't expect listening to go away whenever you want that to go away. It's mainly learning a skill to listen to others, to acknowledge their presence, to acknowledge their ideas. Okay, what are some of the examples of upward communication? When we talk about upward communication, people, we are talking about communication that comes from subordinates to superordinates, so supervisors. And when we talk about them, we mainly talk about inevitable problems and exceptions. We also talk about suggestions for improvement. We also talk about reports of performance when you go and send an email to your manager or you give a performance appraisal report. We're talking about outward communication. So it doesn't have to be in speaking form or in vocal form. It could be in written form or in other forms as well. Grievances and disputes, financial and accounting information. So these are all parts of outward communication that you could be using. Sometimes maybe you will be sending a P&L report to the manager, or you could be sending a patient report. It could be sending a balance sheet. That's still an outward communication. Barriers to upward communication usually revolve around attitudes of the subordinate and actions of the supervisors, and also characteristics of the organization. So we always talk about organizational characteristics. Let's say your organization is very flat, meaning that there's no hierarchy or there's no hierarchical barriers between the roles and responsibilities, I mean positions, then there won't be much upward or downward, but mostly interchangeable communication styles. But when you have a higher hierarchical organization, which is large, bureaucratic, there's a lot of red tape, a lot of laws and responsibilities, which are kind of definitely set with clear boundaries, then you have some barriers, and that means managers and employees cannot get together really easily. In meetings you may not be asking similar questions or some questions but some others. So these are all barriers. And again, the characteristics of the organization, your attitudes about asking questions or turning in reports, and also attitudes of your superordinates, superiors, make a difference. How to improve the upward communication? Well, how to improve those communication is willingness to build relationships. So whenever you want to improve that, you should be hesitant to reach out to a superior. You should be hesitant to reach out to your supervisor or manager because you want to build your relationship with them, and you're willing to do that. Sensitive, objective superiors. Sometimes we have superiors who are very objective versus not so objective. They could be very subjective when they make evaluations. So that kind of might be a problem. But if you have like sensitive enough and objective enough superiors, then that's great. Balancing the upward communication process by using different channels as much as possible, using emails as well as face-to-face meetings or today's Zoom meetings, and also some maybe reports. So some written and vocal material with different aspects and modalities of communication would be great. Increasing informal contact. So again, even though you're not formally tied to that superior or to the manager, You can create some informal relationships with them. It means it doesn't mean you go and talk to them anytime, but it means you have some kind of networking skills and you use them to connect with them from time to time. If you have a common problem in the workplace that you want to discuss, or there might be some interdepartmental exchanges of information, or it could even be conflict, you should be open to build and create these informal taking action. So whenever possible, taking action to improve the communication process is one of the most important things you should be considering doing. And yes, it's really, really important. Especially sometimes when you feel there might be some misunderstandings between the two of you, you need to make sure that you take action, even though it's from your side first. It doesn't matter. You're still taking that action, and it's very valuable. Lateral communication. So sometimes we have communication that relates to intradepartmental issues, which is related to problem solving, coordination, or sometimes some advice to line departments. And sometimes there are some barriers to lateral communication, like communication with face-to-face, peer-to-peer. Uh, it could be a increased specialization makes it harder. Let's say you are working in a healthcare setting and you want to talk to somebody in the internal medicine from somebody in the uh, you know um, uh, what do we call another department, like you could be talking to them from a nutrition department. So let's say there are differences in specialization, and that means you are using different language, you are using different jargon, you are using different ways of addressing one another. Again, these could be barriers, but they could be opportunities for improvement as well. But know that the more specialized you are in the profession and in the workplace, it could be in banking as well. Like sometimes people in the project finance may not talk the same language as people in downstream services, like people who are in the downstream service lines, the online banking issues, the branches, the people in the branches, bank branch. So these could be all different because one is more like B2B and the other is more like B2C. So you could be having some barriers. Um, Lack of management recognition and reward. Sometimes people may not recognize that you're spending the best effort to talk to other people. And because you don't see that kind of recognition and acknowledgement for the communication that you spend effort on, you might have the barrier. You might not do it, or you may not feel called to do it. Suppression of differences. If your differences are suppressed instead of being, let's say, reinforced, then you have these barriers in place. Uh, Differences should not be the reason for us not to communicate. In fact, the opposite. Our differences should motivate and reinforce us to talk to one another even more, because differences mean we have so much to learn from one another, and suppression of those differences are really, not good for natural communication. How to improve horizontal lateral communication? So we are needing to be increasing awareness of some of the goals and some other people's and departments' problems. So don't say this is not my problem, I don't care. Just know their problem should be related to you as well. As long as you work together with one another, their problem is your problem. Because in one point, at the end, someplace, in one way or the other, the problem will leak to your department or to your work process at some level. This is inevitable. And then social events, that would be great to do. Today, it's really hard, but we still do some virtual coffee breaks, for example, or virtual lunches or dinners. It could be. Job rotations. People who go, we will learn more about this in time, but remember from our design chapter, you know, job rotations, like going from different jobs, different departments to another, so you learn the language of other people and other departments and other professions. Training. So make sure you're trained on using some of the organizational communication terms or jargon or some important concepts and terms in the business that you're partaking. So the training. Integrated devices, the people with liaison roles. This is utmost critical because the liaisons usually are the people who do not have necessary hierarchical relationship with the people inside the organization. What they do is that they very much ease the process. They make sure the project management goes as smoothly as possible. They don't really form a hierarchical relationship with you. They don't really tell you what to do, but they are like outside advisors, people who are just there to help, to facilitate, but not necessarily to direct or control. Okay. Rewarding effective lateral communication. So make sure you are rewarding communication between people to people, peer to peer, colleague to colleague. Because if you don't reward those, they may not find the incentive to talk to one another because they might feel, well, why do I need to? We don't really work together. But if you're rewarding these types of interchangeable dialogues and those interlinkages that people form through communication, if you reward those, they become ingrained in your organizational culture, which over time becomes a practice, a commonly used practice, and that kind of eases very much, smooths out your project and tasks and your performance in the bottom line. Encouragement of full and free expressions and disagreements. So make sure you talk about your agreements and disagreements at the same time, and you encourage talking about them. So you're not really, giving the impression or giving this, hidden message that, you should be limited in your expressions, that you should not be giving information in its full form, but you should be giving them as intact as possible and with all of its components as much as possible. And this should hold true for your disagreements as well as your agreements. Okay. So agreements, disagreements, it doesn't matter. We need to be able to feel the freedom and this sovereignty to be able to express ourselves with different people in different departments and the organization as a whole. Communication load, the rate and complexity of communication inputs. Okay, so communication load meaning the rate and complexity. So whenever you talk about communication load, you either mean very frequent, so it means a lot of exchanges back and forth, and also the complexity is very dense. So what it means is that number and difficulty of decisions being made, time available, which is kind of stressful because it's little, and quality of information is very high, which is required, and predictability of information inputs, so meaning how predictable those become. And the less predictability they have, the more complex and the more challenging it becomes for you as a communication overload. And make sure you don't turn that into that kind of thing where you feel overwhelmed or overloaded with so much communication. Or sometimes in opposition, you have underload, which means you don't have like enough consistency in communication. The quality of inputs are not important, and you are having like you don't really have enough time to cover all the things that you need to cover, so you just don't communicate. Make sure this is neither an overload nor an underload, and make sure you balance these out really carefully by looking at the rate and complexity of the communication inputs and the communication processes. Informal communication channels. So sometimes we may not have formal communication channels, meaning emails, reports, meetings, and such. We might be having some communication channels which could be informally based, informally structured. So that's sometimes we call management by wandering around. So managers, they go around the room, they go around the meeting. Sometimes they partake in the Zoom meetings just to interact with you, to exchange information. And you don't necessarily have a prior agenda when you wander around or when you go around the table. You just talk to them, you rain, you just collect information. and you exchange information, you give some information to them. And then open door policy. Usually that helps because you may not get the information you will get otherwise. So it could be, sometimes too late, or there could be huge amounts that you will not have access to unless you have open door policy, meaning that during certain times during the day or certain times during the week, you will say to your employee, say, you know what, you can book a session with me today or with a Zoom. Today we're not in a physical space, so it's virtual, but still open door meaning on certain days they could be freely talking to you if they schedule not so much ahead of time, but they could have an instant meeting with you. This is an open door policy, how instant it could be on certain days. Organic structures and rapid change. So a lot of times organizations might be having mechanic structure. We might talk about it also in the culture piece, but organic structures meaning those are organizational structures where it's very flexible. Like people could be replacing one another if the project entails or requires them to do so. You could also see this in organizations where the hierarchies are not that strict. So people are freely exchanging information with one another without considering their hierarchical relationship. And of course, organizations such as startups who are in a very rapid change process, or let's say organizations which are network based, which are just, uh, organic organizations, very flexible in style, less rigidly structured. There is some structure, but it's not rigid. So these are all important points we need to match in open door policy to be possible. But again, it requires you as a manager to, lead the people to feel free to reach out to you that day. That requires some time allocation from you. So you need to be able to be ready to give that time because it might happen any second. Sometimes I do that with my students and say, carry out a Zoom meeting with me. If you have a class project or group project, I can be available on a Monday. But then it means I have to allocate that chunk of time to those students. I had to carve out that important time because that day I gave them the freedom to book a session with me, and in that time I can't do anything else. So again, it could be time consuming, but again, you are able to receive a lot of information in huge amounts, which otherwise you wouldn't be getting, or you would be getting it too late before it would be useful for you in the certain time and place, or in a certain decision. Uh, and again, sometimes it doesn't have to be managers. It could be person-to-person communication, networks of employees. That's not officially sanctioned. So, which means the organization creates this environment of easiness and, channels availability to organizations, to employees all around the organization so that they could freely exchange information, ask questions, exchange ideas, and provide inputs to one another and giving also feedback. So these are important, some, bits and pieces of communication channels that you could use. And yes, they could be formal as well as informal. And I want to say here that informal could be as important as formal channels. Sometimes in organizational communications, we have individual barriers. So individual barriers could be as important as some of the organizational barriers, but individual barriers could be coming from your interpersonal issues with other people. It could be related to your channel of use and the media that you use, semantics, the meanings of the words, meanings of statements that sometimes could be misunderstood, inconsistent cues. Sometimes you might be giving an inconsistent indication that you're available. In fact, you may not be. So these are all some of the individual things to consider. Sometimes you could be problems in active listening, which I mentioned before, active listening and understanding other people, spending the effort. Sometimes you may not be able to choose an appropriate channel selection. Some of the people, before they talk on the issue on the phone, for example, or on a Zoom, they want to email it back and forth first. So knowing what kind of channels to use and when is phenomenally important, is so important that using the channel as well as the selection is also, both of them are so important. It's not just the usage of it, but also selection of it is as important as that one. Knowledge of others' perspective. So making sure that you're willing and able and motivated to know about others' perspective when you come together, when you exchange information, or when you talk, when you're in a dialogue. What is the other's perspective? How does the other look at this thing? How does the other see the issue? Does he or she see it from your angle, or is that a completely different way of seeing it? So the perspectives matter so much, and you will see in the end of this slides, my lecture, you will see that there are, importance of perspectives which could be different. And if we are not careful about the knowledge of others' perspective, then it really gets in the way of working efficiently, communicating efficiently, and in terms of our healthy communication practices, this is a big hurdle. And then, of course, management by wandering around. You could be having a problem with that. You may not like it. You may not like it as a subordinate. You may not like it as a supervisor or a manager. But again, these are all considered to be individual barriers to organizational communication that we talk about that usually gets in the way of effective performance, effective organizational output, effective project. What are some of the organizational barriers that we talk about? Well, these could be status and power differences. Sometimes, you could be seeing, and we will discuss this more in our culture discussion, but if you have so many status and power differences between the people, if the culture is in such a way that there's very high power distance between people, that you are not allowed to talk to anybody in the top management or email anybody. They are not approachable at all. So these are status and power differences. Sometimes they could really form barriers in terms of communication. Departmental needs and goals, if they are too conflictual with others, if there is no common ground on which they could agree and work on, then these could be very, forming very high barriers. Communication network, sometimes unsuited to the task. The task maybe entails that you provide some kind of a, let's say today we have Slack, for example, or Microsoft Teams. We could use these for, effective task management. But sometimes we might better use emails for that rather than Zooming all the time. So if our network, the way we use communication, the way we use other people's communication styles, which is unsuited. Like people may not really prefer to talk to one another when they do the task. In fact, the task requires them to talk often, then that's a problem. Lack of formal channels. Sometimes you may not have those formal channels in place. They might say, hey, you know what? This week we canceled the meeting. So how so? I mean, we lost the chance to, exchange information this week. Then that's formal channel problem. Or sometimes we might have issues in the intranet, in the server, in the company's server. So you might not be emailing some people for a while. So these are important things to consider when you talk about organizational barriers. And if you don't have a climate of trust, we'll talk about climate in our following sessions, in the near future. And climate is mainly how do people feel here. So if there's a climate of trust versus mistrust, that's a great issue when we talk about barriers, because if there's no trust, people won't be opening up. People won't feel that they are actually, free to express themselves. So, and again, formal channels, development and usage of them is very important. Encouragement of multiple channels as much as possible. Not only emails, but meetings, Zooms, phone conversations, reports. These are all very important. The channels, the more channels you use, the better you get your message across. Changing organizational group structure to fit communication needs. So if you are able to change your organizational structure, meaning if the organization is organically formed, there is no strictly structured organization type, or your design is very flexible, which means you can change group work anytime, you can change formation of teams anytime, you can change some of the departmental structures anytime. then this is important to remove the barriers in your organization. And yes, you if you're able to do these tweaks according to your communication needs, then that's great. And before I leave you with this, I wanted to give you some video examples in terms of some problems in communication, guys. And I know, I'm sure you will find this useful to see how sometimes communication could be a big issue in solving or sometimes creating more problems even. So communication styles, the way we communicate, the way we listen or don't listen, have so much repercussions in our performance and in our workplace motivation and satisfaction overall. It could lead to people leaving, as in the case here. It could lead to turnover, increase in turnover. It could lead to, again, dissatisfaction. And then in other ones, some hints about communication in the organization you might find useful. And so before I leave you with that, please, go over this chapter. You can also read some of the, free ebooks that I provided you with communication concepts, and be familiar with it, and make sure you also respond to your discussion posts before the due date as much as possible. Okay, so I'll see you next time with groups. See you.